What if I disable that? That way it only has one option. That's why. So it's the permissions.
Oh, okay.
That's why.
Okay. But next time when I go back to work, I can have them. I can see if I can adjust it and play with it to see if we can override it.
It's weird that it's showing up. YouTube won't allow me to take it.
Yeah.
And then I'm not able to disable PC webcam without permissions. That's weird. I don't know why it's like that.
It's all good. We can go ahead and get started. I'll just use this one. And then I think we got people. Oh, yeah, we got some other ones. So I'll just use this one and then we'll just go from there. I appreciate it, though.
Yes, sir. However I can help.
Yeah, man. Yeah, this a lot of the technical stuff, like the webcam and going live. I'm new to all that.
I was born, yeah. I did too.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is weird. I don't know why. I mean, I do know why, but I don't know why.
Yeah.
Why would you want to do that?
Yeah. So we're already here live. I think our people are live are here. I'm trying to make it so that it was kind of clear to see a live PowerPoint. So I'm still working on getting this new webcam and getting that fixed up so that, because a lot of people have to hit me up and say, hey, I'll be watching it on live. And so I'm trying to order more equipment and stuff so it'll be better to see it there. But for those of y'all that's in person, thank y'all for being here. This is our second People's African History class of the year. So thank y'all for showing up. I think the first one we did on the first Saturday of the month, we did our Kwanzaa. So we talked about the holiday of Kwanzaa and the celebration of Kwanzaa, what it means, debunked some of the myths around Kwanzaa, and then we talked about how it kind of helps us bring in a new year with a certain level of unity, giving us the principles, the values, kind of putting us in the mindset and the framework for understanding how we can be our best selves. So not only that, the things we can do to help contribute to our communities and make our community stronger and better. And so that's how we ended the last night. So we'll talk a little bit more about the beginning of that before we go into what we're going to talk about today. As always, there's literature when you walk in. So we have a sign-up sheet. So definitely, if you are new here and if you're not getting the emails, please be sure to sign the sign-in sheet so that you can get reminders of the class, so that you can get reminders. We're always here every first and third Saturday from 1 to 3 p.m. But obviously, I know you have schedules and you have work, school, families, so you're probably going to forget. So sign your name so I can remind you. And I try to send reminders before everyone so that you remember that we are here and that we're doing this. So far, we have been consistent since we started. We haven't missed one, and that is the goal for us to continue to be consistent in our African history classes every first and third Saturday. So please make sure you sign the sign-in sheet. Not only that, but we also have literature. We have flyers. The flyer for the organization that puts this on, I say Institute. We also have literature for whatever we're going to talk about today. I always like to have something that you can take back to your people, to your families, to your children, about whatever we're talking about today. We also have flyers about the class, so you can grab these, hand these out, take pictures, put them on your Instagram, your TikTok, your social media, any of those things, so that you can just spread the word that this is what we have going on. What I said, so we got flyers, we got literature, all of that. So please don't forget to come through to the desk, either on your way in or on your way out, and grab some of that as we go ahead and get started here. So I think that is everything today. So last class again, like I said, we talked about Kwanzaa. But before that, the series that we've been going on, as you know, with this class, we started all the way from the very beginning. Who we are as African people, and African people started from the beginning of civilization. So we went all the way back to as far back as we can think of to start our story about who we are as Black people. And we have been going down chronologically the history of who we are. And so now we talked about the transatlantic slave trade, we talked about the Middle Passage, we talked about the European invasion on the west coast of Africa, the west and the central part of Africa. We talked about that. Middle Passage, how we got over here, what that was like. And so now, where we are in our story is we are now here in the Americas. So we're going to talk about life in the Americas for our ancestors, what it was like, the good, the bad, the ugly. And when we say the good, I'm talking about what we brought out of the good. Not that the system itself is good, but what we brought out of it, how we overcame, what we created despite the situation that we were in, despite the conditions that we were in. And we're going to talk about slave life in the U.S. We've also been talking about slave life in the Caribbean, and we're also going to talk about. So we're going to talk about that as well. And then after we get through with this series, we'll talk about emancipation and the growing and the creating of Afro-American and African communities outside of the continent. And we're going to talk about how we began to thrive and grow and develop and evolve after that as well. So this week we're going to talk about slave life in the U.S. and then I started to do like just a quick section on slave revolts, but I think I want to do a whole day where we just talk about revolts and resistance. Because in school we already learned about this. You know, they love to tell us about slavery. They love to make movies about slavery. They love to remind us, y'all was slaves, y'all have to depend on them. They love to talk about that, and it is a part of our history. But they don't never like to talk about when we was fighting back. They don't never like to talk about when we would put poison in the family meal and kill the whole family and start running. They don't never like to talk about when we resisted and that we didn't just sit around and wait for somebody to free us. We have always created ways to ensure our self-determination and ensure our freedom. And so we're going to spend a whole day just talking about that, right? Because that when we teach our kids that's a part of their psyche. That lets them know that anything that's happening to them, they don't have to sit back and allow anything. That's a part of our tradition. We've always been a very innovative people, always been a people that's been creative, and we've always sat back to figure out ways how to make our situation better. You know what I mean? So we're gonna spend a whole day talking about that. But today we're gonna talk about slave life in the US. And so we are gonna go ahead and get started. Gotta figure out a way to have a better video on that stream, but until then, this is where we are. So as you know, I like to start with the review of what this is about. So they can come on in. That was good. The people, why we call this the People's African History class, the people means by us and for us. And so when we do this African history class, it means when y'all come on in, feel free to sign the sign-in sheet so y'all can get information about what we got going on here. So thank y'all for coming. Sign in, and we're going to go ahead and get to it. The people means that this class is for us and by us. This is for all of us. This is for Black folks. This is for our history, our elevation, and our upliftment. We learn from each other through these discussions. So, yes, I'm up here facilitating the discussion. Yes, I'm up here teaching and providing information. But this is an open forum. This is a sharing of knowledge. So there are things you know, there are things I know, there are things we all know. And I want you to raise your hand, talk, say, you know, how you feel about a topic, or if I say something that reminds you of something, or you have a question, or you have a comment, just raise your hand. This is an open forum. This is a collective learning process, okay? We're learning from each other. It's not like how we were taught to be in school and just sit, listen, be quiet for 8 hours, right? This is the African way in which we learn. I wish we could put us in a circle so we can do it like that, but, you know, the layout is conducive for that. But this is a collective learning process because that is the African way in which we learn. We're all learning together. The purpose of the knowledge is to uplift all Black people, not just some, not just people who know, people who don't know, people who read certain books, people who from this sub-community of our community or that sub-sector of our community. This is for all of us, right? So this is to uplift all Black people, and we learn about Black history from Africa to the United States and all around the world. So when we say African history, we're not just saying we learn about people on the continent. We mean all African people. So whether you consider yourself African American, Afro-Caribbean, Afro-Brazilian, whatever, right? If you are melanated, if you got melanin, if you brown, black, dark, light skin, whatever, if you from Africa, then you are an African person. This is for all of us, right? You know, some people like to say they're African. Some people like to say, well, I'm American. I'm not African. You decide for yourself what you want to call yourself. But what we're saying is that this is for all of us who are of African descent, right? Black American, Caribbean, anybody. And so we learn about our journey and our history from Africa to the United States and all around the world, right? So that is what we are doing here with this class. Again, make sure you sign the sign-in sheet, either as you come in or as you leave, so we can stay in touch with you so you know what's going on. As we say, please share knowledge with the group. And yeah, because I can't cover everything. I try to cover as much as I can. We only got 2 hours. So obviously this is a lot of information. So I hit certain points and then I gotta move. But we can always try to go into details either in this class or maybe in another class. So with that being said, we'll go ahead. I'd like to always do a quick review. Last time we talked about Kwanzaa, a 7-day festival beginning on December 26th, created in 1966, ended on January 1st. And we talked about the history of Kwanzaa, the significance of Kwanzaa, specifically the principles and the values that it covers to help us move into the new year with a good mind, a refreshed mind, a renewed mind, and a mind of upliftment, a mind of unity, and a mind of faith in our people, in our Creator, and the well-being of who we are as African beings. We talked about Mama Karenga, who was a former Black activist who started and initiated this holiday and this way of thinking based on the Nguza Saba, based on the Kauai doctrines that he studied within his African studies. And so we talked a little bit about that and how this was being used to help create the foundation for Kwanzaa. So we discussed that. So we talked about that and how in Swahili, Kwanzaa is Swahili for the first fruits. So for those of us who grew up in the church, in the Black church, and you're taught to give tithe and offerings and give that first 10%, that's really just what Kwanzaa is the first fruits, the first percentage of who you are, you're giving to yourself and your God and your people. So thinking of these things as we go into the new year. So that was what we talked about last time. And so today we're going to talk about life as enslaved people in the U.S. And so some of the takeaway that I want you to kind of picture is more of a description and kind of storytelling, right? What the conditions in which we lived in the U.S., both positive and negative. One of the things I want to say from the takeaway, or how the takeaway kind of lays it out, is that field hands usually lived in very small cabins with dirt floors and no windows. Our ancestors would eat cornmeal, sweet potatoes. Sometimes we would eat meat. And on the plantations, we were allowed to raise vegetables and chickens in whatever spare time we could find. So sometimes we had spare times on Sundays. And so Sundays we would be able to plant our own food and sometimes even make our own money. We're going to talk about that in a second. So sometimes we would use that little bit of time that we would have for self-determination and to do for ourselves. An enslaved person with a valuable skill may have special privileges. So some enslaved people work as carpenters, mechanics, blacksmiths, cooks, wagon drivers, and house servants. These people, we're going to talk about this a little bit later as well, but our ancestors who were enslaved who had special skills, when we were free, that was the beginning of the Black middle class. That was the beginning of when we began to take those skills and use them to now start our own businesses. That was the first entrepreneurial class of Black Americans. So those enslaved Africans that were skilled in cooking or blacksmiths, there were a few who ended up becoming the first Black millionaires. Abraham Lincoln Lewis, first Black millionaire out of Florida, right? Who else? The one in Atlanta, Alonzo Herndon. He became our first Black millionaire. He started out as a barber, right? He cut white folks and Black folks' hair. He learned how to do barbering as an enslaved man. And then when we were free, he started his own barbershop business, opened up a bunch of barbershops, and used that to help launched his wealth, and he became the wealthiest man in America, wealthiest black man in America. So a lot of our ancestors who were skilled, when we were free, used those skills to make money for ourselves and our community. But they were house servants were enslaved. Some of them in the master's houses, and they would wear his family's cast-off clothing. They were enslaved every bit as much as the field hands were. Enslaved Africans who had special skills might be hired out by their masters to work on other plantations for a day, to a week, or more. Some were musicians whose masters would hire them out to play at parties on other plantations or in cities. A few so-called slave owners allowed their enslaved people to keep part of the money they earned to buy their freedom. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that as well. As we move forward, I think it's important for us to discuss the differences between U.S. slavery and older forms of slavery, right? A lot of times, especially in our kids' schools, and maybe in our schools when we were learning about slavery, one of the examples or one of the ways in which white folks kind of try to use to absolve their own conscience and absolve their responsibility in this whole thing is they try to say, well, slavery existed already anyway. It was already here, and it was just a part of, like, there were other communities, there were other nations. We didn't start this, right? This wasn't something that white folks did, and that's very true. White folks didn't start slavery, right? And so this was not anything new in terms of using and trading human beings for goods, right? For services and things of that nature. And so it's very true, but there's a way and a context in which we need to talk about this so that we understand that while the idea of slavery and the idea of people working for other people was not new, this form of slavery was very different, right? This form of slavery was different from what the world had ever seen. This was chattel slavery. And chattel slavery is the idea of using people and seeing people as less than human, as less than property. This was very unique, right? This was not something that we had seen much in the past. And so this chattel slavery was not conditional, but it was racial. And oftentimes in other forms of slavery in the U.S., most of the time people were enslaved because of their condition, because they couldn't pay it down, or because one nation had captured another nation, right? So it was based on conditions, and when those conditions changed, then those people were freed. And when they were freed, oftentimes they were integrated into the nation that captured them, or they could go back home. So it was very conditional. Oftentimes it was for a short time. Yes, sir.
Maybe you're going to get to this question. In other parts of the world where they had slavery, were the people kidnapped and then transported thousands of miles, as it was here? Or was it like they were enslaved from around their region or maybe a neighboring country?
Right. So there were, most of the time, this was prior to the European expansion and the what they call the exploration of the West, or the knowing that the Western Hemisphere existed. Everything was kind of close. So typically, if you had like the British enslaving the French, right? That's still very close by in terms of countries. So everything was kind of close during that time. Or even those people that came and enslaved, even when Europe came to enslave Africa and brought them back to Europe, still very close proximity. So this was the first time there was such a great distance, an entire ocean between African people and people in the Americas. And so also, the reason why this was able to last for so long, because the message of the type of slavery that existed in the Americas, it took so long to get that message back to the continent and get that message back to African people that really by the time our people on the motherland knew the type of slavery that was going on, it was too late because it was such an integral part of the economy, right? But many of them didn't know that this type of slavery was so brutal, that this was slavery that lasted for a lifetime. Most people who were enslaved were not enslaved for a lifetime, right? You were enslaved for a time and then you were free. And so that is an important part of that comparison. Yes. Oh, yeah, sure. We're going to try to, for those on the stream, we're going to try to adjust the camera for the YouTube and see if we can work that. Let's see. Oh, it's like people were not recognized as human beings, but as property that could be mortgaged, traded, bought, and sold, and used as collateral, given as gifts, and disposed of violently. So there have been other slave systems that denied enslaved opportunities for manumission, and they made the status of slaves heritable, which means you are allowed to transfer a person from one generation to the next generation, and treated enslaved people as objects to be worked, raped, and killed as will. And so older forms of slavery say that across the ancient Mediterranean, there is evidence of very horrific practices, branding, whipping, bodily disfiguration, sexual assault, torture, torture during legal trials, incarceration, crucifixion, all of these different things. And we've seen some evidence of this even in some of our biblical studies. So if you study the Bible, if you study theology, there is evidence of very horrific forms of slavery all over. However, what the U.S. did and what we see even with the expansion of white folks, as Europeans begin to gain power, we see that much of what they did to control the world had already existed, but they just expanded. And so the scale to which this type of horrific slavery and horrific subjugation existed was very small. And what the U.S. did and what Europeans did was they just kind of expanded it and scaled it to the point where it became essentially global, right? U.S. slavery was America's brutal system of slavery. It was unlike anything that had existed ever anywhere in the entire world. Chattel slavery was not conditional, but it was racial. And there was blatant hypocrisy of democracy that were part of the underpinnings of what it meant to be enslaved, right? So these ongoing effects of the slave foundation is what made it different because it still exists today. In other parts of slavery, and when we talk about slavery in other parts of the world, it wasn't systemic. It was purely for the building and the creation of the nation. So once that occurred, these people were free. In America and in the West, we were enslaved, and then after that there was what? It was Jim Crow, and then after that we had mass incarceration. Even now we have gentrification. Now we have the control of our education, the control of our political system, and so it just takes on these different forms, right? Where in other parts of the world, at least in older parts, once it was over, it was over. So the fact that it is so systemic in our country and it is systemic in our way of life even now makes this form much more brutal than in the past.
Often references the Arab slave trade. Was that you said most of the slavery once it was over the globe. Is that included in that in your reference?
Well, no. So the Arab slave trade and the transatlantic slave trade kind of go hand in hand. We talked about that in the past for a couple of lectures, for a couple of classes as well. But the Arab slave trade was kind of the beginning, right? Because much of what the Europeans learned about how they participated in the slave trade, they learned from the Arab slave trade, capturing African folks in the West and taking them into what is considered to be the Middle East. And then Europeans learned that and used that and enslaved the Africans in the West. And so even now to this day, Arabs and the Arab systems still benefit from the slave trade. So we're talking about even way before even the Arab slave trade. We're talking about, the idea of the story of Egyptians enslaving the Hebrew Israelites and Chinese forms of bondage in China, between China and the Mongols, all of these different, much older forms of slavery. By the time we get to the Arab slave trade and the transatlantic slave trade, that is where it becomes more challenging.
I do have a comment. I think you mentioned, I hope I'm summarizing what you said. It seems like you were saying that look at the U.S. specifically and how slavery was somewhat different, as in after people were free, but look at the morphing of the situation with Jim Crow and then apartheid. I would like to venture forth that slavery in the United States, Haiti, Brazil, and all these places in the West, I find that would have in some way ended in the same way in terms of whenever emancipation came. But the reason that it morphed, as you say, in the United States is because the U.S. was one of the only places that was a white settler colony.
You said white settler colony?
White settler colony.
Oh, white settler colony.
And therefore, when Africans were released, Emancipation Proclamation, the leadership of the Black people here decided, maybe wrongly, that they thought that Black people here should stay. White people punished the Black people for that, saying, okay, because even Lincoln chided the Black civil rights leaders at the time and said they were selfish for not seeing that whites would forever be grieved by the very presence of Black people, and that Black people would never be able to achieve anything just because of the racism put upon them by whites. And that since the Civil War was fought, Lincoln felt like white people would not at that time stomach the ability to want to physically cast Black people out through a war, because they had just had a war between white people over the so-called Negro problem. And Lincoln said that he was prepared to use the resources of the federal government to get Black people out of here, and that would solve the problem. But if you stay, you take matters into your own hands, and you feel like he didn't have a choice to make them leave. So Black people became apartheid through processes of Jim Crow, because after slavery, for whatever reason, we stayed, and we did not have a land space of ourselves as a separate country, where all these other places, whether it be Haiti or Barbados or Jamaica, the white settlers, a small proportion of them, they left. And Black people, those places, basically had a sovereign country or spaces that would at least become sovereign, where these Black people here are basically stuck in a white settler geospace. That's still the case today. I just thought I would raise that and get your response. You may not agree with my perception of that, but I'd like to hear your thoughts.
Well, yeah, I think another idea of that was the reason why enslavement took on these various forms is not only based on locale, which is what you're talking about, being controlled within a space as opposed to being able to leave or wanting to leave. Talking about the enslavement of the mind, believing that, well, now that this system is over, we can be free, as opposed to taking advantage of Lincoln creating this country of Liberia that was supposed to be this freedom state for African Americans. So you're speaking about that, but then also in older forms of slavery, when large amounts of people were freed, oftentimes they were emancipated or liberated with reparations. So there was a certain payback or something to allow these people to be able to integrate back into that community or give them the resources necessary to build for themselves elsewhere. And so we've seen that with other forms of oppression all over the world. And that is something that we as African Americans have yet to receive. It was in the form of, initially, it was supposed to be in the form of what?
40 acres and a mule.
The 40 acres and a mule. But did we get that? No. Most of us did, right? My aunt found out that our family actually did get, so some families did get their 40 acres and a mule, and some of us may still be benefiting from that land. And I know our family did, right? But then a lot of it was taken through taxes and all kind of other stuff. But for the most part, most African people still have yet to receive that, those reparations.
No, I was just going to say, you already said it. Some people did. And as soon as Lincoln was assassinated, they started snatching.
It up. Yeah, absolutely. Another thing I want to talk about when we talk about the life or what makes this different from other forms of slavery is also the irony of freedom in the U.S. So the U.S. was one of those places where, on paper and in public, it would espouse this idea that every man was free, and every man at that time was free. And it was a place where you could be your best self if you worked hard enough. And not only did they say it, but they put it in their founding documents. And so the irony of freedom in the U.S. is that in this place that is claiming to be free to the rest of the world, it functions off of the subjugation of an entire group of people, really an entire group of two people, Native Americans as well. And so the Statue of Freedom on the Capitol is literally a Native American woman, right? Thomas Jefferson recommended a black man to build Washington, D.C., while at the same time enslaving African people himself, right? Slavery was the lifeblood of Washington, D.C., and if we look at some of the documents, it was actually one of the most brutal slave markets in the entire nation. And at one point, Washington, D.C. was the murder capital during the crack era. So you see how those things oftentimes kind of become cyclical, become full circle. Thomas Jefferson was so-called in love with a woman by the name of Sally Hemings, but still was a functioning slave owner, still owned African people, right? And so again, you see this democracy, this woman that you claim you love, also you enslave her and her people, right? And then probably one of the biggest examples of the irony of freedom in the United States, or so-called freedom in the United States, is the speech by Frederick Douglass, "What to the slave is the 4th of July." Has anybody ever heard that speech before? What to the slave is the 4th of July? So I'm going to read just a piece of that, and I oftentimes will, every time around so-called Independence Day in the United States, I like to post this just to remind us and to remind our people and remind everybody that when they were celebrating freedom, we were still in bondage. So, in my opinion, right, I may have a different opinion, but in my opinion, the 4th of July was not my people's Independence Day, right? It was not my people's Freedom Day. And so, Frederick Douglass, just this piece of the speech that he gave to a congregation of white people, he said, "I answer a day that reveals to him more than all other days in the year, the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is a constant victim. What to the American slave is your 4th of July? To him, your celebration is a sham, your boasted liberty and unholy license, your nation greatness and swelling vanity. Your sounds of rejoicing are empty and heartless. Your denunciation of tyrants, brass-fronted impudence, your shouts of liberty and equality, hollow mockery, your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgivings, with all your religious parade and solemnity, are to him the black man and woman in America are then bats, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy. A thin veil to cover up the crimes that you've committed, which would disgrace a nation of savages. There is not a nation on the earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of the United States at this very hour. That's the speech that Frederick Douglass gave to a congregation of white folks when they were celebrating the 4th of July. And he was saying, that don't mean nothing to us. Because at the time that you're celebrating this, you are still enslaving millions of my people.
I just want to add on to that. I always think about how when we talk about the Aztecs, right? Or these other like South American, whatever we talk about, well, they used to cut each other open and eat each other's heart. Oh, they were so brutal and they were so like, brother, y'all ate people.
Right,
like,
right.
So I just want to add that, like, that is,
No, and the brutality that existed, even when we go well into the 20th century, and many of the ways in which the U.S. has castigated other parts of the world for the brutality that they did, whether it be Hitler, right, or whether it be Rwanda. Many people use that as examples and say, well, we actually learned that from y'all. we studied history, we studied U.S. history to learn how to create systems of oppression all over the world. I was watching an interview with what's that person's name? Trevor Noah. Y'all know Trevor Noah, the comedian, and he was on the Daily Show and all of that. And he's from South Africa, right? And he talked about how he grew up during South African apartheid. And he talked about how in growing up and studying South African apartheid, he considered that to be like the most perfected form of racism. And they learned how to create apartheid based on studying the United States. They studied America and perfected the mistakes or the holes that they found in the way that America did its racist system, and studied other forms of racist systems and say, okay, now we're going to do it this way in South Africa, right? And so a lot of times when Americans would criticize South Africans for apartheid, they were looking back at us and saying, no, y'all were the teachers, y'all were the inventors of this thing. So I think that's kind of goes to what you're saying.
Can I ask you, what do you think why is there such a cognitive dissonance in America? Why can the average American look at apartheid and say that's bad, and then come back to the U.S. and just blank slate, no thought process? What do you think that is?
That's a really good question.
It bothers me because
there's
so many parallels right from first page of Google.
Yeah.
Walk outside. Yeah. You see it. It doesn't process.
I don't know if it's capital. I don't know if it's capitalism that blinds people. I really don't know how people can see what other people do if you can't see it in your own. Right.
Piggyback on what he said. Actually, even before the holding on to white supremacy, nationally and globally, that would be to me, that would be like the basis of power.
Yes. Yeah. That's a good point. Yeah.
So they see, they just don't want to tell you. Right.
World War II. Yeah. All that stuff that went on in World War II, all that destruction, you can blame Hitler if you want to.
Right.
But back in the 30s, Hitler sent attorneys over here to the U.S. Not researchers, attorneys, to scrutinize Jim Crow and all the other stuff that was going on and take it back over there.
Yeah, absolutely.
We had to fight our own Frankenstein.
Eugenics. They study eugenics and the nature of or how legally we reinforce eugenics in this country, and then use that to then create this, the Nazi system in Germany. So yeah, absolutely right. So this is all of this shows this irony that exists that again made this system of slavery very different from others, right? life of an enslaved person. So people who were enslaved, especially those in the field, oftentimes work from sunrise to sunset. So we were working all day, and all the way up until the nighttime. We couldn't see anymore. Pulling up the notes real quick. Okay. Even small children and the elderly were not exempt from these long work hours. People who were enslaved, especially those in the field, worked all day. And enslaved people were generally allowed a day off only on Sundays, right? Only on Sundays, and maybe sometimes on Christmas or what is considered to be Independence Day, the 4th of July. During some of the hours that we had some free time. Most of our people, most of our ancestors performed work for ourselves. So we would do work that we needed to do. For ourselves, we would grow our own food. Sometimes we would either get hired out or we would go to other plantations and we may make money for ourselves on those free days, on those Sundays, or on those off days. Many enslavers did not provide adequate clothing, and mothers who were enslaved often worked to clothe their families at night after long days of forced labor. So after working in the plantation all day, all the way up until sunset, those same mothers would then go into the so-called slave house and then begin to knit and begin to make clothes, make pants, make shirts for their children. So first they worked for the so-called white man and then begin to work for ourselves and our families. Enslavers could break up marriages and separate families as they wish. So one area of anything beyond that, the basic needs that we needed was up to enslaved people to provide for ourselves. And so many enslaved people lived in small stick houses, and we're going to look at some images of that in a second, with dirt floors and these large cabins with very few windows, and there were cracks in the walls. So during the winter times, it was difficult to keep the heat inside of those shelters, inside of those homes. And so we had to find ways to keep ourselves warm. One area of the lives of enslaved people that we were actually able to exercise our autonomy was in our families. So it was in our families where we had some level of independence. And honestly, it was in the family where we started to create our own cultures. That was when we started to create our ways of life that still exist today. Calling each other Mr. and Miss, not being able to call your mama by their first name, right? Or your daddy by his first name. Levels of respect that we instill even today started during this time in the family. So enslavers felt it was to their advantage to allow people they enslaved to marry because any children from the marriage would add to their wealth. And according to law, a child took on the legal status of the mother. So it's very interesting. I do want us to talk a little bit about that because enslaved people, so-called slave masters or enslavers would allow for enslaved people to, in some states, to get married. And if they fell in love with somebody on the plantation, they could marry. But then they would do something with that. What would they do, and how would they use that against them when they would allow us to marry each other? So sometimes enslavers would allow Africans to marry each other, the man to marry a woman, but then how would they use that against us?
Sell your kids.
Mm-hmm. Yep. What do you want to say? I'm going to come to you.
As a method of breeding.
As a method of breeding, absolutely.
And if I understand the spirit of it, what you're saying, like threatening one spouse versus another, you sell them.
Right.
You know.
Right. So we're going to let you marry each other. We're going to let you have a family. And then when I get ready to want you to do something, I can use this as a bargaining tool. I can say, oh, you don't want to do this? Or you don't want to do that? I'm gonna sell your wife over here. I'm gonna sell your children over here, right? So they knew, because one of the things we talked about when we talked about the Middle Passage, when we talked about the beginnings of the transatlantic slave trade, is that one of the things Europeans understood was at the basis of the African nation, at the basis of the economy of the nation and the basis of the nation state was the what? The African family, right? Everything was always based off of the family. So they understood by studying us for centuries how important our families were, right? And so they use that oftentimes against us, even during slavery. So, let's see.
I got a question.
Yes.
So, well, at that point, were the married women exempt from the, I'll call it the Epstein mentality of the slave owner?
No,
If I catch my drift.
no.
No.
Explain Epstein mentality.
Oh, you haven't been watching the news. Well, you know, Master has some company over, and hey, they need some entertainment, so it don't matter whether she's married or not. You lifetime entertainment.
Right. So we're talking about just because this man is married to this woman, just because our ancestors were married, did that excuse her from being able to be raped,
From being a concubine.
from being assaulted?
And it didn't have to be somebody who was visiting. It could be within the family of the slave owner.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
They had license to do whatever with the slave women as well.
Mm-hmm. And we actually have a slide where we just talked about the women experiences during enslavement.
Yeah, I was also going to say that, the system is so brutal. Any resistance to, I don't want my wife taking sexual abuse. A man may be raped.
Yeah.
Those are hard subjects, but very much true. By the way, I wanted to ask you. You mentioned about Thomas Jefferson and about Sally Hemings. Was not Sally Hemings a child when Thomas Jefferson raped her around 12? So that would make him a pedophile. I think that
Epstein.
I think that people don't really want to delve into the fact about him and other slave owners, regardless whether Thomas Jefferson was a so-called scholar and an architect.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a good point. You're absolutely right. I forgot to bring that point up. Sally Hemings was only 12? She wasn't 18, right? The way it was, right? 12 years old, a child, right? And I understand this was a different day and time and how people looked at women. I think the idea was that as soon as you started your period, right, then you were considered to be a woman. Thomas Jefferson was much older, right? So absolutely, right? You have pedophilia, you have rape, you have assault. That was very common amongst our women, right, during the enslavement process. Yes. So, and again, we're going to talk more about that, just our women's experiences in enslavement. Let's see. Oh, yeah. So people who were enslaved usually had to ask permission from their masters to marry, and those marriages had no legal protection. Enslavers could break up marriages and separate families as they wish.
So would you say that a lot of behavior that we as a people is experiencing now and is learned behavior, is something that we learned from the white man that we, brought into our own, because it sounds like back then that was unheard of amongst us, pedophilia and all of that, amongst us. But now it's coming to light that it is now, would you say that a lot of that is learned behavior? And I heard you talk about how I heard him say that in other countries during slavery, they could point out, what was going on. But then in the U.S. is, we're just kind of oblivious to it. And, I would say that the U.S. is a master deceptor. I mean, we deceive people because we got the media, and it's a psychological thing too. It's not just right in your face where we can see it. It's a psychological thing because they'll show us committing all the crimes on TV, and all this other stuff until we ourselves even begin to believe that about ourselves, So how do we get back? How do we get back to knowing and believing who we are and what we're supposed to be, before all of this? How do we do that?
Yeah. You asked a question about learned behavior, or was this learned behavior? And that was something else I learned as well, just in my own studies and my studies from teachers who helped me understand this. And that is a lot, particularly around the family, a lot of the things that we tried to do after we were so-called free or emancipated, and we had our own families, a lot of the ways in which we tried to engage with our women and our lives, we did that because we learned from the white slave master, right? And so the white master was able to hit his woman and was able to talk to his woman in any kind of way, and was able to, have his woman, but then sleep with all these enslaved people, and she just sat around and didn't say anything or didn't do anything about it. And so sometimes when we were finally free, we tried to emulate those same behaviors, and that didn't work for our women, right? Because the African woman and even the enslaved woman in Sojourner Truth says this as well. We were right. I was right there with you. In her speech, she says, "Ain't I a woman?" She says, "I could bear just as many lashes as the man. I picked just as much food as the man. I was in the fields from sun up to sundown, just like him, while pregnant. And I could eat just as much as a man." And so with that, some of the things we tried to adopt from white folks, we tried to emulate into our family structures, and that don't work. We have to remember that the way in which we do family, or religion, community, business, it has to be from the African perspective, not trying to be like him, right? And then I'm gonna go to what you were saying about how do we get back to that.
See, now, to me, the other reason why Black men couldn't get away with some of that foolishness was because the master's wife didn't know nothing about the kitchen. The Black woman knew how to fix hot grits. So at some point, them hot grits were going on.
And knew how to poison the hot grits. So rat poison in there, you don't even know it. But yeah, so to get back to that point of how do we get back to that? I think getting back to that is unlearning and recognizing some of these things and the ways in which, the reason why I'm doing this isn't because this was how our people did it or how we were raised. We're trying to be like people who didn't even see us as human beings. And so I think it's that unlearning and the unlearning and the relearning of how we as a people decide that we want to do our families, how we as a people decide that we want to create our communities and raise our children and not look to other histories and other people for that type of frame or for those examples. I see you in that.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think the lady's question up here, she said, well, who are we? As to how we get back to certain kind of values. I think that's a very important question. I don't even think we can get back to any kind of values because her original question, nobody's really answered. Who are we? For example, your the title of your seminars are the African people's African people's history class, right? So yes, I agree with that. We are African people. But I'm not sure that at least for people in this country, they agree that they're African. I think the majority of Black people don't even think they're African. You got Black people right now talking about the slave trade didn't even exist. So until people here say that they are African, not a duck like you say I'm African and say, well, I'm black.
Right.
No, that you're African now, and then that becomes a reference point of who you are, so that you can get back to what you were.
Mm-hmm.
You can't get back to what you were if you don't have a foundation of who you are.
Right.
So where's that? You know, I'm not saying you. I'm saying historically. Where is that conversation? Why is it that we have such a hard time saying today we are African people? Not I'm somebody of African descent, like, oh, my forebears were African, but I'm not that now, or that, well, I'm black, and that doesn't mean I'm African. Or if somebody says I'm African American, he said, well, what does that mean? That means you're African? No, that means that my ancestors were African, and I'm American now. Everybody ducks the fact that they're not African now. And until we address that, we cannot delve into what this lady in front asked. How do you get back to something that you don't have an anchoring of who you are now?
That's a really good point. I agree with that. Absolutely. Yes.
I was gonna say, with your point about, maybe you made it.
We all want to hear.
We
all want
Sorry.
to hear.
So
I need to remember to play the other microphones.
Oh, okay.
with the point about us taking some of their ways of life, you know, the newer generation now, the kids. I was born in '99, and these guys that are coming up in like the 03, 04, 5, 06, you know, the kids, they're starting to see a lot of what they call the patriarchy. You know, you go on Instagram, everything, you know, the patriarchy. And originally, I took that kind of even personal. I was like, well, I'm a good man. You know, my dad's a good man. My granddad's a good man. I'm starting to realize now that what they're talking about are those behaviors, the learned behaviors. And so I just want to make that point too for some of us that may not be so in touch with the kids, so to speak. You know, I feel like one myself. That is what they're talking about. I'm starting to see that now. It is those learned behaviors that we've kind of picked up over time.
Yeah. No, that's a good point.
But I also think that as we were coming over from Africa through the Middle Passage, the goal was to disassociate us, the Africans, from Africa and what they knew about Africa. And they did a pretty good job, by the way, through the brainwashing, the torture, you know, the deaths, the raping. You know, by the time we got here, we didn't even know who we were. You know what I'm saying? And some parts of America or the world still have active African culture intact. They never lost it. Like Salvador Bahia in Brazil. They have a section that, you know, is strictly just African. But when we get to the Americas, and particularly in America, I think that was taken away from us, who we were, the societal structure. And so we have to unlearn the ways of the plantation owners, and we can only learn who we were by coming to classes like this. Okay, we're doing the study on our own.
But see, like right here, and I know you want to bring this up about the African. I need a microphone.
Oh yeah. So they can hear you on
Oh, yeah, okay. All right. When you bring it about African cultural stuff, squelched here, I don't think it's squelched at all. Right here in the Southeast, the U.S. is so tapestry with all things African, and I didn't know that Dr. Grant was going to have that picture up, but right there on the right side picture, like where you show like a porch or some sort, that's African right.
But we're in the Southeast, but where is that up the coast?
Right.
Where is that in history of
Right. But the anchor bed of Black people in this country, in the Southern United States, 1865, 90%, all the Black people in this country were in the Southern United States. And so the wellspring of everything, mostly tapestry in the United States that is African, comes out of the Southern area. Even jazz itself is a Mandingo word, Yazi.
Okay.
Right? So I'm saying that all we have to do is to re-explore the tapestry fully of everything in this country. Everything to yams, like yams, comes from African American yami. We just have to explore it. It didn't go anywhere. It's just been melded in to the tapestry of the United States. And anybody's talking about Southern culture, this is just white people saying Southern culture, but underlying that is things that Black people fix, grits, the whole 9 yards. I'm just saying we need to explore that and not think that Africa has gone away. We just need to unsurface it.
Okay, so there's unlearning, miseducation.
Yeah, but we are African
All of
people.
that,
It's never
all of
gone
that.
anywhere. But if I
We're
heard what
on
you
the
said,
same page. We're
no,
on the same
not
page.
really, because you're saying it's gone away. I'm saying it's not. We just need to resurface it.
I think what it is that it's gone away because it has not been integrated or it has not been taught to us, and so it exists.
That's our fault.
Right. Well, structurally, it was white folks that kept that apart, and then since the emancipation, we have in many ways, whether it be the Garvey movement, whether it be many ways, we have tried to reconnect ourselves, whether it be going all the way to the Black Arts movement in the 70s, we tried to reconnect ourselves, and oftentimes we would get punished, right? Our leaders would get imprisoned. Our leaders would get killed. Many things would constantly happen the more we would try to reconnect ourselves to Africa. So I do believe that that is a significant part and a central part, again, which is why the name of this is the People's African History class, because that connection with Africa is a key part of understanding who we are and a key part of rebuilding and reestablishing not only our old African ways, but also understanding that we live in a new generation, and then also applying that and advancing it and modernizing that as our generations continue to advance forward. So I definitely think that that's part of the unlearning and relearning of who we are. And so this is just an example real quick, about 40 minutes left. This is an example of the slave house that we were talking about our people, after working out in the fields, they would come back into houses like this. And this is where we, where we lived, where our families were, where we slept, where we ate, and this is actually the beginning of African American, well, I don't want to say this, well, to a degree, the beginning of African American culture, our culture that we kept from Africa to the United States, and then the cultural ways and ideas and norms of the family, of the Black family, was started right here, right? Right here, as well as the Black church. Started right here in the home family of the Black church. This is an image of an enslaved African who was captured and has a net over them and is getting ready to be brought into the enslavement process. This actually is also a reminder of oftentimes African people, particularly in Florida. Once Florida became a full-fledged slave state, even in Florida, African people were captured like this and oftentimes put by the water. And does anybody know why they would put us by the water for what purposes enslaved African people in Florida were used by the water? Bait. As bait. What kind of bait? Alligator bait. Alligator bait. Right? There's a whole history and a lot of documentation that show that Black people were actually used to catch alligators, babies specifically. African babies were used to catch alligators. And they would put us out there, and the alligators would come, and they would, sometimes they were successful, sometimes they weren't, pull the baby back to catch alligators, right?
And I just want to say on that, that's why that alligator Alcatraz thing bothered me specifically so much, because I knew about that.
Yeah.
So to watch these people go out there and take pictures with the alligator Alcatraz sign, all happy and stuff. Not only are you, there's an obvious problem right there in front of us. But then when you know the history behind in Florida specifically, but I'll tell you that the cognitive dissonance of the average American bothers me on a daily basis.
Right.
That in particular was another.
And this is why for me personally, the teaching of African American history for me is important for my people, but it is also very important for other races as well and other cultures, so they can understand that these things did not just go away. Just like our African pretensions come back up in who we are through our families and through our religion and through the way we talk and through some of the things that we made, some of the names we may give to our children. All these different things come back up. The horrors of America and not to the States, but the evil of what has happened in the past also comes back up. And that is why this history is so important, not only to us, but this history is important to all races of people so that they can know, oh, this is what happened in the past. This is how we don't repeat this now and in the future, right? So that's very, very important. But that's for somebody else to do. I ain't necessarily the biggest trying to educate white folks like that. Property as the center of American life was a key part of slavery in the Americas, right? So again, we talked about this before. The enslavement of African people was not based on racism. It did not start because white people hated black people or white people hated African people. In fact, black people were deified. Black people were seen as examples of how to create a successful civilization. So again, this started with capitalism. At the very center of American life, at the very center of slavery in the Americas was this idea of property, chattel, and how can we advance our economic structure. So all of this is based on capital. Also, central of the Western philosophy was another idea that was very central to American slavery, and that was ethnocentrism. The belief that one's own group is the center of everything and all others are scaled with reference to it. So this is even found in the research, often called the reference category. And so ethnocentrism is this idea that there is one ethnic group that sits at the center of morality, that sits at the center of success, and every other group is subject to that ethnic group. A lot of people claim that the North was the free liberal area, and it was the South that was conservative, and it was the South that was anti-Black. And even now, when we think about the North and the South, when we think about who's progressive and who's stuck in the antiquated times, we always think that, oh, it's the Northerners or the liberals, and it's when you come to the South, and that's where you get hate, and that's where you get anti-Blackness and racism and all of that. But is that necessarily true? No, why not? It's everywhere, right? Anti-Blackness and prejudice and racism was everywhere, right? So why did slavery die in the North?
Because some of it was because of the weather.
The weather?
Also because of some industrialization.
Right.
That it made it that slavery would die because the cash crops that eventually make money, sugarcane, tobacco, and cotton are more in the South, and that's why white people got rid of the slavery in the North, but decided that all of the slaves in the North mostly would be brought down to the South to cultivate these new crops that we found in West Mississippi, like Alabama.
Absolutely. And the West, right up north, the plantation season was much shorter, right? They could only grow food from what? Maybe April, May till September, right? Before it starts to get cold again. And then, right, if that. And then once it starts getting cold, there was really no need. And so we still got to keep these enslaved people alive through the rest of the year to start the plantation season again. It's actually costing us more money than we're making by continuing slavery up north. So we have to keep in mind that slavery didn't end up north because these people were more conscious. It didn't end up north because they said, you know what, this isn't a good way in which we should treat people. We should stop this. No, it ended because it didn't make no money. Remember, the property and capitalism is at the center of American life. Not necessarily hatred or anti-blackness, that came later, but it was about what was going to make us the most money. And then what they realized was, well, if we end the first part of the economic sector, the primary sector, which is the exhuming of raw materials from the ground, if we end that up north and begin the secondary sector of an Indian economic structure, which is the taking of the raw materials and turning them into goods, we'll make that what we do up north. So in the South is where they get the raw materials, and it is up north where we take those raw materials and we turn them into goods. That way, this expands. So we'll take the part of the economic structure that's not helping us, and we'll add that piece. So the Northerners still benefited from what was going on in the South, right? They didn't benefit direct. They didn't see it directly, but they were able to close their eyes from it and still benefit from all of that work and all of that labor, and got rich on it.
And then had the audacity after the Great Migration to take all the factory jobs out of there.
Exactly. And then after the Great Migration, then take off. And then all those factories and all that wealth that you use almost 100 years later in 1960s and 70s with our families and my father and grandfather and all of these people were making money out of these factories that we helped build. Now you take those away and send them overseas. Now our people stuck in power, right? So again, this is an ongoing thing, and this is why Malcolm X said, if you listen to the teachings of Malcolm X, he said everything below Canada is the South. Because at that time, people, whenever he would teach, and people would say, "Well, we live up north, and we live better, and we free, right? Things are better up here." And he said everything below Canada is the South. As long as you're in the U.S. context, you enslaved. As long as you're in the boundaries of the United States, you're in trouble. Don't think that there is anywhere that you're going to go here that you're not going to experience the hand and the evils of the white man and the hands and the evils of this white structure, right? So everything below Canada is the South. Loyalty to the country will equal gradual freedom was an ideal that many still adhere to. Dr. King, President Obama, Booker T. Washington, but the Constitution still allowed for slavery, and the quest for wealth was more important than moral fidelity to human rights. And so again, when we talk about the significance of slavery in the Americas, yes, we talk about it from a racial standpoint, but it's very important that we see how significant capitalism and wealth expansion was in this whole ordeal, right? Tribes of the Indian nation. So this is just an example, and I always like to show this map so that we can see what the country looked like prior to the European colonists coming in, separating everything, and oftentimes lumping all these people together. And I don't know if you remember, this was classes ago when we talked about what I showed you a picture of what Africa looked like before it was colonized, right? But now when we see Africa, you see Nigeria, you see Ghana, South Africa, Uganda. But if we looked at it pre-colonialism, it looked like this, even smaller, where it was just a bunch of nation states. It was just hundreds, thousands of just different nation states, right? Very similar in the United States, it was the same way. It was just a bunch of different tribes. And they functioned together, even though it might have been thousands of them. But they knew how to function together, and they did it for centuries, longer than we've been doing it here in the Americas, in modern America, right? And so this is essentially how the tribes, this is one map of how the tribes possibly look even during this time, right? There may be issues and conflicts between them, but for the most part, everybody lived in peace, right? One significant aspect of slavery in the Americas and life as an enslaved person was one particular crop, and that was what? Cotton, right? Cotton was king in the South. Everything was all about cotton. And the more you could pick, and the more you could master and monopolize on this product of cotton, the richer you could become, right? How many of you have ever been to a cotton field and actually have picked the cotton? Tell me about your experience. What was that like the first time you had gone to a cotton field and you actually bent down to pick that cotton for the first time? What was that like?
It was sobering.
Mm-hmm.
Because I did the walk from Selma to Montgomery a couple of years ago, and we walked past cotton field. But when I said it was sobering, I think it gave me chills. You know what I'm saying? And even when I went to President Jimmy Carter's funeral in Plains, Georgia, my GPS took me through the back roads from Jacksonville to Plains, Georgia. And I rode past multiple cotton fields. And they even in Plains, Georgia, still have a cotton processing plant or warehouse. But it just gave me the chills.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Everybody else?
Also, I went up to as and cotton was growing all over South Carolina and everything on the ground.
Myrtle Beach.
Yes, I was going to
Myrtle Beach.
from Jacksonville.
Absolutely. Anybody else?
I did. I went when I was a child. They took us to what they call not a school project. When they get to school, the kids field trip. Thank you. They took us on a field trip to a cotton field or whatever it was, and that was my first time with it. So as a kid, didn't really. I was just glad to be out of school, you know. But then going back and looking at it, even the idea of like you're gonna take all these little black kids to go pick cotton, like, you know? Even looking back on the memories now, it's kind of jacked up. I would say that's when I was in school. I was in Mississippi. I was in school in Mississippi, and they took us to go pick cotton. I was too young to really have a thought process about it.
Yeah.
I might add that coming back home to Jacksonville, I didn't go through the back roads.
Right. You say
I
about
stayed on the main highway.
no, it's real.
No,
Yeah.
it is real.
Yeah.
It is real.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it is real.
Absolutely. I remember the first time I picked cotton in a cotton field. So when I went off to college, I went to a historically black college called Oakwood College, now Oakwood University. And I remember one day we were far away from campus. I don't know why where we were. Me and some friends were driving, and we used to see the cotton field all the time. And then one day I said, you know what? I never really actually pulled over to actually like get out here and see and experience what this was like. And I remember pulling over and actually picking cotton for the first time. And it was just such a sobering experience. It was so ethereal. I almost really felt like I was taken back in time. And actually, if you ever pick cotton, you know that when you pick it, what's all around the cotton? It's thorns all around the cotton, right? And you have to be real strategic in how you get through those thorns. And then how big does the cotton grow from the ground? So some of the cotton is here. But a lot of the cotton is what? Way down. And so you talk about big black African men, 6 foot, 3, 4, 6. They got to get extremely low to that ground to be able to pick that cotton for hours. Sun up. That is a horrible experience. Yeah. Absolutely.
Twilight Zone.
Yes.
Especially when
Absolutely.
you think about it. I'm talking about the minute where I began, the babies out there.
Yeah.
Babies. Yes, pregnant women,
Yes.
right? Having to be that low to the ground
Babies out there.
and have babies on the feet.
And then not only that, but then after the women give birth, right back out there.
And after they give birth, they may have a day or two, and then you gotta go right back out. And then, how light is cotton? How light is cotton? Cotton is real light, right? Cotton don't weigh nothing. But our ancestors would have to pick maybe 40 or 50 pounds every day. There was a quota that they had to meet every day. And so you had to have about 50 pounds of cotton in your bag every day in order for you to go to sleep. And if you didn't pick that meet that quota, what could happen? You could get the lash. You could get raped. There was some kind of a punishment if you didn't meet that cotton quota. So 50 pounds of cotton is a lot of cotton because cotton don't weigh nothing. Right?
Some of your major insurance companies today still exist. In the multi-billions of dollars, still exist today, man. They're well.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, I would say I know not for today, but I wish sometime in the future you might be able to do a talk on right when you're talking about the cotton gin, right at the time of Louisiana Purchase, to be able to talk about that expanded territory starting from the bottom of it, parts of Louisiana and Alabama up, and how when those new lands opened up, how the Africans, as a part of an internal slave trade, were shipped from Maryland around the bottom of Florida all the way to the Gulf Coast, Louisiana, Alabama area, so that they could pick cotton to expand what was the United States with a new crop. And so they figured, well, since these new lands opened up, it would just transfer Africans from Maryland, Delaware, places like that, where slavery was becoming lesser, just transfer bolts of Africans to new spaces to open up these new lands that were considered at the Mississippi and west.
Yeah.
And people would be shocked today to know that some of those places were parts of the French colony. When Bill Clinton was asked one time, well, you had to go to another country or so, where would you be a citizen? And he said, France. And the reporter said to him, well, why France? He said, well, since I'm from Arkansas, the territory of Arkansas used to be a French colony. So therefore, I would have been a French citizen. People don't realize that all that area, France, all the way up to where we get Wisconsin. That's why we like Eclair, Wisconsin, French name, Detroit, French, all the way up to Toronto.
Chicago, I mean, founded by Haitian. Absolutely. And then cotton was such an incredible resource because everybody got to wear clothes, and so England had an insatiable demand for cotton, largely because it was so cold up there. And so they were a large part of the reason why the slave labor existed in the South. So going back to what you said, a lot of banks, a lot of insurance systems that still exist today started from the need for cotton, and that came out of the United States, right? So whoever controlled cotton made a significant amount of money, and essentially you were providing sort of clothes and things for the entire blankets. Everything is made from cotton, or a lot of things are made from cotton. That went all over the world, right? And so when Eli Whitney the person who was said to have created the cotton gin and made an easier way to exhume cotton from the ground, that made it quicker, and that expanded the whole slave labor process with cotton even greater, right? That expanded it even greater. So cotton was essentially the king of the South, and this is why it was so significant and made the so-called need for slave labor even greater. And so here's just an example here. Cotton was considered, well, that was a phrase back then, cotton is king. And these were just black children that are picking cotton, right? And as you can see in the right plantation, you can see cotton for miles and miles. I mean, way more cotton than you can possibly imagine. And we were forced to pick that, send that up north, and then do that day in, day out, right? Women's experiences in slavery. I think it's significant because, again, as a sociologist and as one who takes an intersectional approach to studying these things and studying history, I think it's important for us to talk about our complete experiences, but also understand that the experiences, not just in slavery, but our experiences in history differ based on our gender. They differ based on our class, based on our gender, based on a lot of different things, our nation, our place of origin. And so while as Black men and as Black women, we had a lot of very similar experiences in slavery, there were some things that only women experienced that Black men didn't really think about or didn't have to think about as much. You talked about even the sexual assault on men and the rape and the buck breaking of Black men during that time. And that was very much a part of the Black experience in slavery, not as much. It was not as great as the raping of women, but definitely did exist. But women's experiences of being their bodies, only their bodies not being theirs, but their bodies essentially being that of the so-called slave master, was very different from men. So women's experiences in slavery was very real. Unpaid labor for white men's wealth started with their capture on the west coast of Africa. And it was very different from women in that women were not only laborers for white men, but they were also the reproducers of the labor. So they were the labor, and then they made the labor because they did what? They made what?
The babies.
They made the babies. So they were the laborers and the reproducers of labor and the sexual object of male lust, right? So that's a whole different type of psychological and emotional enslavement that women had to deal with, right? So that's a very important point. Yes.
Would you not? Well, let me ask you. Do you think that the breeding farms that were used, breeding process, also was tantamount actually to more Black men who were being forced to rape Black women for the procreation of children?
Sure.
That actually, in some ways, was actually greater than the slave owners' rate. In fact, there's reports that numbers of Black men were actually unknowingly forced to rape their own daughter to produce children, when the daughter may have been sold off early, and they didn't know, who the daughter was, what she looked like years later. And we had these breeding farms.
Yep.
Sometimes the Black men would rape their own daughter and produce the child.
Right. I can imagine that happening. I don't think that's that doesn't seem far-fetched. I've never read it, but it doesn't seem far-fetched just in terms of how those breeding farms existed. But absolutely, that was a part of that process, right? These breeding farms, for those who may not know what breeding farms are, these were farms where they would get enslaved Africans, they would get what they would consider to be the biggest black male, the black male that was the strongest, the black male that worked the most, the black male that was the healthiest, and then they would get these black women Africans, and then put them on these farms and force them to have the baby together, force them to have sex, or essentially force the man to the woman, so that was rape, and so that they can create these almost these super slaves, right, or super African people for the production of labor.
To add on to that, watch the movie Drum, starring Ken Norton, the boxer. Ken Norton from back in the day of Muhammad Ali. It deals with that. At the same time, slavery had been abolished in the North, so-called. So the importation of slaves had been abolished. So the next step was, well, if they can't let us bring them in, we'll make our own.
Right.
Then I have to, and I'll conclude with this. I don't want to take away from the psychological damage that was done to the woman. But men's psyche are fragile too. Correct. I can't protect my wife. Right. I can't protect my daughter. So now I've got a son that's looking at this, or somebody else's son that's looking at this. So why am I going to get attached or value a black female when I can't protect her, I can't help her, and everybody else is treating her like whatever? That's something we have to deal with.
Yeah.
And then also, in that sense, as a black man, I can't protect her, and as a woman, I respect and value my husband, but essentially he can't protect me.
Right.
Because at any moment, this white so-called slave master can now come in and have his way with me, and he can't. And so, what does that do to the family unit? Right? What does that do to the family unit? And so, many black men would put their lives on the line, and they would say, "You know what? I know I got to go. I know they're gonna find me. They're gonna catch me. They're gonna kill me. I gotta kill this man for what he did to my wife, because I just can't be a man. I don't know how I can live and be able to sit and allow this to happen to my wife and happen to my children." And I'm gonna go back to the breeding farms, and then I'm gonna come back to you. But there's a movie, I don't know if you ever seen this movie by it's called Ma Rainey. And it's with Chadwick Boseman. I think it was his last movie. Chadwick Boseman, Ma Rainey.
I've seen it.
Chadwick Boseman and Viola Davis, who plays Ma Rainey, is on that. I think it's still on Netflix. It may still be on there. But Chadwick Boseman talks about this experience of, I think, his dad. And I think his dad, the white man, came in and did something. This wasn't in slavery. This was during Jim Crow. The white man in Mississippi had done something to his family. I think maybe raped his mom. And his dad couldn't do anything for a while. He just laid back. And then afterwards, he got his family out of there, moved them somewhere else, and then went back and killed all those men. Right? He knew he wasn't coming back because they were going to catch him. And he ended up getting caught and lynched. Yeah. But he knew he had to do that to honor his wife and his kids. Right? And so that is a very important point. These women experiences affected them, absolutely, but it also affected the psyche of the black man as well. And to go back to the breeding farms, I think it was in the 1980s. I can't remember. It was a white sports reporter. I can't remember his name.
Oh, yeah.
But when they would make these suggestions, what's his name? The Greek? Jimmy the Greek Snyder. Jimmy the Greek Snyder. He made these suggestions on a sports report, right? It was on cable, I think it was on cable television, of why there were so many black men in basketball, in the NFL, and in the NBA, and why they were so greatly, why they were so much better than the white athletes, right? And he suggested that the reason why this existed was because of breeding farms. And the reason why this existed was because the the black enslaved man was breeded with big black enslaved women, and they created these big black children, and then they would breed with other big black children. And so now he said white folks did that during enslavement to make money, and now it's coming back to bite us in the behind, and now they're taking over our sports. And so that was a big thing. He got fired for that, right? He got fired for that.
Saturday Night Live did a skit on that.
Oh, really?
Yes, they did.
Oh, really?
And the guy that played Jimmy the Greek said, well, you know, we could get some better athletes if we get that Bo Jackson to get with that Oprah Winfrey.
So that, but it's real. Like the idea of breeding farms still, some people believe the effects of it still exist today, right? It's crazy because trying to take away from the idea that maybe these athletes just work hard. You know what I mean? Maybe they're just talented and they work hard. But yeah, wow, I saw you and we don't. Oh, did you have that? Okay, I saw you. We'll come to you and we go to keep going. Yeah.
One comment. I think the breeding piece was really put in, you know, in the very, very early 1800s after the slave trade had been forcibly abolished, or the trade of bringing Africans from the continent to these places. And then it became a matter of, okay, well, let's ramp up the production of Africans. That's one. And also because I said before, the U.S. being a white settler colony, whites were always concerned that the number of Africans, overall, did not outdo them in terms of population. Where in these other places, Haiti and Grenada and places like that, just keep bringing Africans by the truckload because there's only a few slave owners there, and so they didn't care how many Africans, they just kept bringing them in. But here, because white settler colony, they were concerned about controlling the numbers of Africans. So the breeding piece allowed them to scientifically say, okay, well, it's only going to be a certain number of Africans, and we're not bringing them into our trouble because they didn't want Africans to outnumber whites, especially when whites were also concerned about, the population of indigenous people, and they began to expand west beyond Mississippi.
Absolutely, yes.
On the topic of the sports announcer, that is still like very prevalent, very common. I'm an MMA fighter as a career choice. That's what I do daily. And so, you imagine I'll run past a lot of Instagram comments.
Right.
Man, I would have fought a brother. We both from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Me and the brother both fought. We had a good fight, whatever. It was all love afterwards. And as you're walking out, we just had a fight, but we're still two brothers. Ain't nothing to it. And as we're walking out, you hear somebody from the other side talking about some bingo. And we both stopped and we looking into the crowd trying to figure out who said it, but he ducked off. And so that's still very real.
They called you
What they were saying was like a Mandingo fight. Because me and the brother, two black dudes from Milwaukee, right? So we fought, but because he's a good dude, whatever, we talking on the way out the cage, and then over on the side you hear some Mandingo fight. So even that is still very prevalent. Sometimes you'll hear other comments like, because the black fighters in the MMA world right now, you got black fighters, and then it's like these Russian Dagestanis, those guys are kind of dominating. And so it became a thing of the joke is that the black people are good because you have 300 years of training. That's what they say in the comments. You'll have a good black fighter, black champion fighter, whatever, and then in the comments, 300 years of training, 400 years of training. So they understand, they know, and they play with it. And that again,
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. We got a few more minutes. I'm going to finish this slide. African women experienced rape from the slave ship all the way to the plantation. So it didn't just start in the Americas. Even on the slave ship, African women were feared for their lives, feared for their bodies from being raped and being assaulted on the ship all the way to the plantation. Her breasts and her reproductive areas were examined for capital purposes. So you can imagine when they're put on these auction blocks and they're looking at parts of her body, they're looking at her breasts, they're looking at her reproductive areas to see how well she'll be able to reproduce, right? And then the better she looks and how well she'll be able to reproduce, what happens to her price? It goes up, right? This is real. These are real things. But she was still told to perform the same duties as a man while pregnant, right? While pregnant. Again, we talked about Sojourner Truth's Ain't I a Woman? And she says, I do just as much as a man. I work just as hard as a man. Sometimes while pregnant and still having to have these same experiences, right? And we've seen that in present day. We've seen entertainers, Rihanna, Serena Williams, Beyonce, do the same things as their male counterparts, right? Performing or doing athletic competition. Some of them do it while they're pregnant, while they're having a baby, while they're holding the baby, right? Or creating a baby. Groom, harvest, prepare, slaughter the livestock, milk the cows, cook, serve food to themselves and everyone else. So these were some of the things, some parts of women's experiences in slavery. They did both hard labor and they did domesticated work. So it wasn't that the women were just in the homes and they were just making the food and just serving the family and serving the so-called master, but they were out in the fields as well, right? They were picking the cotton as well. Example, right? This is important. This is an example of an enslaved woman breastfeeding a white baby. But what is significant about, there's so many, we can have a whole conversation just on this. What is significant about this enslaved woman breastfeeding this white baby? What are some of the things about that?
The fact that a child's mother couldn't produce breast milk.
Sometimes could produce breast milk or they felt what?
And the slave owner felt that the breast milk from a black woman was much stronger.
Yes.
And actually could provide better nutrients to a little white child.
And they thought that whole time, still telling her that she ain't a person, a human, treating her as an entity.
Right. Absolutely. So you're a property, but you're good enough to give my baby the best nutrients.
Yeah.
Right? Because remember, we talked about that. We were talking about the history of the doctors, the black medical facilities, the black medical history, going through slavery and all of that. And oftentimes when white folks would get sick, they would go to the healers in the fields. They would go to the black healers over the white doctors because they realized that we do things about the earth, we do things about plants, we do things about vegetation that they didn't even know. And oftentimes we will provide better medicine to heal them. So again, this is extremely important. Also, one of the things I didn't hear somebody say was the idea of breastfeeding was something seen as antiquated. The idea of breastfeeding was seen as nasty. That was something that they did a long time ago. That was something that you did when you weren't civilized. Civilized people didn't do that, right? And that's where you get the creational formula and all of that. But now, in the present day, the past maybe 30, 40 years, the breastfeeding movement and more black women breastfeeding their children is becoming more popular, or has become more popular, because we realize, oh, wait, that is the best type of milk. And that is the best nutrients for our children is when you breastfeed. And it's not the formulas and all of those things that they put in there, right? So, but essentially, the health of the white nation, the health of white America benefited and was founded on the black woman. So this is very, very important.
And then we were talking earlier about the patriarchy, about the way that we took some of the patriarchal, ways of living, right? We also took some of this, and we still have some of this today in our communities, as far as extending our hands a little bit too much, as far as giving ourselves to feed the so-called babies of other people. So just as much as we took some of that type of negative stuff, we still have some of this.
Right.
Say that.
Absolutely, absolutely. All right, so we got to wrap up. So what we'll do is on the first Saturday of February, I think that's February 7th, we will finish this, and then so I thought I was gonna be able to finish this and do the slave revolts then, but what we'll have to do is we'll have to finish this, and then after that we'll go into the slave revolts. Some of I know y'all like to get let me see the references. So where are we? I'm gonna try to be able to get the. Oh, it's a lot. Kind of crazy. We're talking about reparations. We'll get all the way there too. I got a little excited. I'm sorry, guys. I got excited with this one. Hold on. Okay, there we go. All right, so these are some of the references that you can go, some of the websites, books that you can read, and I'll try to have some more in the next lesson. And always, if you have any questions or if you want to contribute to the class, you can always do that as well. And with that being said, thank y'all for being here. I will see you on the first Saturday in February.
Do you have any type of book club, reading club?
Like book club?
Dustin, do you have any type of book club or reading club that's kind of like offset from this?
No, I haven't started one, but if anybody's interested, we can definitely do that. Yeah, if we want to spearhead a book club, absolutely.
That book by Dr. DeGry, Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. It took me months to get through that book.
Yeah.
Not because it was a hard read, but because I had to stop and just sit with it. Just sit with it. And go back and read it. She does. I'm gonna check her out right now.
Yeah. So, all right. Thank y'all for being here. Y'all have a great day.
You too.
Thank you.
AJ Plus.
Good.
No, that's
I know she's on. She all over YouTube though. She actually does the lecture on the book. On YouTube.
here we go. Okay. So I've seen her talk about the lecture. I didn't know she had her own YouTube page. So
She got a Facebook page too.
she just did a stream 4 days ago.
Yeah.
Have you read it?
All right. Thank you.